Imagine boarding your very first-class flight, heart full of pride and a touch of disbelief, only to be met with cold eyes and quiet disbelief. Picture Lawrence Mercer, a dignified 73-year-old retired school principal, stepping into Orion Vista's elite cabin, only to hear the head attendant whisper, "There's no way someone like you belongs here." What would you feel in that moment? Shock, anger, or the slow burn of injustice we've all sensed but rarely named out loud? Then ask yourself, what if the man denying that seat was a gatekeeper of prejudice? And the very next call from your son, the airline CEO, could ground the entire fleet in a single heartbeat. Could one act of public humiliation spark a movement so powerful it rewrites the rules of an entire industry? In this story of grace, grit, and generational love, we follow Lawrence Mercer's quiet strength and his son Caleb's fierce resolve as they transform pain into a blueprint for lasting change. Are you ready to witness how dignity takes flight at 39,000 feet? If this resonates, give us a like, share this video, and subscribe. Now let's soar into the full story. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin with a soft, constant vibration white noise that dulled everything but thought. As Lawrence Eli Mercer stepped into the first-class section of Orion Vista flight, OV-214, he carried more than his worn leather carry-on. He carried presence, a quiet dignity, the kind you earn, not borrow. He looked around once, gently scanning the rows. His gait was slow, but deliberate, calm, clean navy wool coat, pressed gray slacks, and a mahogany walking cane that didn't click so much as whisper with each step. He paused beside seat 1A, checked his ticket, then exhaled relieved. This was it, the seat his son had surprised him with. First class. For the first time in 73 years, Lawrence wasn't boarding at the back. He'd buried 2 brothers, raised 3 sons, and survived more than one kind of war. But today, this was just a flight. He placed his coat over the armrest carefully and was about to sit when a sharp voice pierced the air. "Excuse me." "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Lawrence turned and found himself face to face with a woman in her late 40s. Sharp red lipstick, perfect bun, uniform crisp enough to cut air. "Yes, of course." He handed it over. Still smiling, still patient. She looked down at it, frowned. "I'm sorry. This says first class. Are you sure this is yours?" Her voice was tight, falsely sweet. "I'm sure. Yes, Caleb Mercer. My son booked it." "Caleb Mercer," she repeated, confused, almost doubtful. "As in, yes," Lawrence said gently. "CEO of Orion Vista." She blinked, then let out a short, clipped laugh. "Well, I didn't expect that." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence stretched long enough for a few nearby passengers to start watching. A man in 1B raised an eyebrow. A woman across the aisle looked up from her phone. "I'm going to need to double-check with the gate," she continued, stepping back but not giving him room to sit. "We've had mix-ups before. You understand." He didn't reply. Just stood there, tall, though weary. He understood more than she would ever know. Another attendant approached a younger woman with curly brown hair and nervous eyes. "Is there an issue, Trina?" she asked quietly. Trina McCall held up the ticket. "Just making sure everything's in order." Lawrence watched her walk briskly to the galley with his boarding pass in hand, as though she were carrying contraband. There it was again. The assumption. He'd spent his entire life seeing it. The pause, the recalculation, the sideways glance. He thought maybe, just maybe, at his age, in this suit, in this seat, he'd left it behind. He had not. The younger attendant gave him an apologetic look, but said nothing. Her silence landed heavier than the words would have. Across the aisle, a woman spoke. "Is something wrong with the seat? He was here before I even put my bag up." Lawrence turned toward the voice. A woman in her 30s, black like him, braids, glasses, tablet in her lap. "Everything's fine," he said gently. "Just a little confusion." She didn't buy it. Neither did a few others, judging by the shifting glances. When Trina returned, her expression had changed, but only slightly. "It appears your name is on the list. But next time, sir, it would help if you boarded with priority. We had no way of knowing." Lawrence nodded slowly. "I did. With Group 1. She faltered, looked again at the pass, then back at him. "Oh." There was no apology. "No, I'm sorry for the confusion. No, please, make yourself comfortable. Just that flat, bureaucratic shrug, the kind that said you got in. But barely." He moved into the seat without another word. Sat down slowly, exhaled again, but this time, not in relief. This time, it was restraint. He looked out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The tarmac glistened like oilskin. Across the aisle, the woman in 1C leaned over slightly. "My name's Janelle. Janelle Avery. I saw what happened," she said quietly. He turned. "I'm Lawrence. I figured that." She smiled. "From the ticket. You handled that with a lot more grace than I would have." He smiled faintly. "Grace comes cheaper than anger these days." Janelle tilted her head. "Still, that wasn't okay." He nodded, and that was all. The conversation dropped like a pebble into deep water. Meanwhile, a man a few rows back had begun typing something angrily on his phone. Another was filming discreetly. The silence in the cabin was starting to shift, not loud, not chaotic, but restless. A tension just under the surface. Something had cracked. Up front, Trina McCall stood speaking with Captain Harris Vaughn, gesturing subtly toward Lawrence's seat. Her voice was low, but pointed. A request to verify something, to escalate. Lawrence didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply folded his hands over his lap and waited. After all, he'd been waiting his whole life. Lawrence Eli Mercer sat motionless for a while, eyes fixed on the window, though he wasn't really looking outside. The rain had slowed, but inside his chest, something heavier gathered. That seat. It was more than just a seat. It had been Caleb's idea. A surprise. A gesture of thanks. "Dad, I want you to fly like you raised me to dream," Caleb had said over the phone just 2 nights ago. "No lines, no judgment, just comfort. You deserve to know what it feels like." Lawrence had smiled, humbled by the thoughtfulness of his youngest boy. A man now. Not just a man, but a force. CEO of Orion Vista Airlines before the age of 41. The same boy who'd once taped pilot stickers to cardboard boxes and made runway noises in the backyard. He'd become everything Lawrence had fought for. And more. But in that moment humiliated in front of strangers, made to feel like a trespasser. Lawrence knew that no seat, no ticket, no son's title could shield a black man from being seen as suspicious. Even when he built the dream, his hands rested on the cane across his lap. Not trembling, but still. "Are you sure you're okay?" Janelle's voice came again, low and careful. He turned toward her and managed a smile. "I've lived longer than most of these folks have understood grace," he said. "I'm fine." She nodded, but she didn't believe him. In truth, neither did he. Because underneath that smile was a sting, an ache that was not new, but not numb either. An ache sharpened by the irony of it all. His son ran this airline. His son signed the paychecks of the very people who now saw him as a glitch in the system. And still, he was expected to remain dignified. From the front of the cabin, the curtain fluttered slightly. Trina reemerged, not making eye contact, but her posture was taut. Captain Harris Vaughn followed a moment later, a tall man with silver at the temples and a clean-pressed uniform that spoke of authority. He scanned the cabin, eyes briefly touching Lawrence's before shifting away. He leaned toward Trina, who whispered something close to his ear. His brows knit. Then, without another word, the captain turned and walked back through the curtain. It was the kind of moment that didn't scream, it simmered. Passengers exchanged glances. A few more cell phones were discreetly lifted. Something was happening, and Lawrence could feel it. Janelle opened her tablet, then paused. "Mind if I ask?" she said, keeping her voice down. "What kind of work did you do?" Lawrence looked at her, surprised. "High school principal. 41 years. Her eyes widened. "You must have seen some things." He chuckled, soft and low. "I saw kids grow. I saw them fall apart. I saw them rebuild. Mostly. I tried to make sure the ones nobody noticed felt seen. That's what mattered." Janelle smiled. "That's beautiful." Lawrence shook his head slowly. "It's unfinished." He looked back toward the cockpit. "Thought of Caleb." "You know," he said after a moment, "my son used to get sent to the principal's office all the time." Janelle laughed. "Let me guess you weren't the one sending him?" "Hardly. I was the one waiting for him with a peanut butter sandwich and a second chance." She grinned, but something in his voice gave her pause. There was warmth, but also weight. "You're proud of him," she said gently. "I'm proud of the man he became, not because of what he built, but because he remembers who he built it for." There was a long beat of silence. Then Janelle looked toward the front of the plane. "So what happens now?" Lawrence shrugged. "They'll fly. I'll sit. They'll forget. I won't." She looked at him, then leaned in slightly. "I'm a journalist. Mr. Mercer." He turned, met her eyes. "Not sure this is the story I want to tell." He said, "It might be the one someone needs to hear." He didn't respond, just stared ahead again. Thought of his late wife, Evelyn. Thought of her hands in his on the night Caleb was born. Thought of her voice always gentle, always urging grace over fire. But even grace has limits. Minutes passed. The engine rumbled deeper now, signaling final boarding. The doors were sealed. Then, as if orchestrated by something higher, or simply by timing too perfect to be coincidental, Lawrence's phone vibrated. "Text from Caleb Mercer. Just got pinged by security alert. Something's happening on your flight." Lawrence hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. How do you explain humiliation in under 160 characters? He didn't reply. Instead, he slowly typed, "I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding. All good." He paused, then deleted it. He started again. "They questioned my seat. Said it didn't look like it belonged to me. I handled it. But I thought you should know. Send." A few moments passed. Then the phone buzzed again. "Give me the flight number. Now." Lawrence hesitated again, then typed OV240. Another buzz. Almost instantly. "Sit tight." He looked down at the message. Those 2 words. So simple. So like Caleb. Sit tight. Behind that was thunder. From the other side of the aisle. Janelle had noticed. Everything okay? Lawrence met her eyes, and this time there was a glint of something new behind his calm. "Resolve. Let's just say," he said, voice steady, "my son's not the kind to let disrespect fly." Janelle blinked, and somewhere behind them, the soft ding of the seatbelt light came on. But there was no takeoff yet, because change was coming, and it was 4 hours away. Captain Harris Vaughn stood in the narrow galley, arms crossed, his jaw tight as the first officer relayed a message through his headset. "Repeat that." "Control," he asked, frowning. A pause. Then, quietly but firmly, "We've received a direct override from Orion Vista Central Command. The flight is officially grounded pending internal review." The first officer's eyes widened. "That's highly unusual, sir." Harris Vaughn didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the passenger manifest still clutched in his hand, the name Caleb Mercer now circled in pen. It all made sense. The man in 2-0, the one Trina had flagged as suspicious. That was his father. And now, the airline CEO had issued a stop order on his own fleet. All because of a single moment, a look, a judgment. Harris inhaled, sharp and shallow. He wasn't new to flying. 32 years in the air. He had handled emergencies, diverted for hurricanes, even once landed with a jammed landing gear. But this was different. This was personal. He stepped into the cockpit and pulled the door closed. "Put the cabin on hold," he said quietly. "No announcement yet." The co-pilot nodded and dimmed the engine startup sequence. Back in first class, the energy had shifted. It was subtle but tangible. A change in air pressure, a kind of waiting. Lawrence sat silently, staring out the window again, though the clouds had swallowed the skyline. His phone buzzed once more. Text from Caleb Mercer, Dad. "Do not leave that seat. I'm on my way." He exhaled slowly, the message resting in his palm like a quiet promise. He didn't smile, not quite, but something in his posture changed. Beside him, Janelle looked around. "Why aren't we moving?" she whispered. Lawrence shook his head once, then murmured, "I think the storm is just beginning." A few rows back, Trina noticed the tension too. She moved toward the galley again, where the other flight attendants had gathered. "We've been grounded," she said under her breath. Bradley, the junior crew member, frowned. "What for command override?" "No way. That only happens for terror threats or VIP retaliation," she snapped, then glanced toward Lawrence. "Turns out the man in 2A isn't just another senior." "What do you mean he's the father of the CEO?" Bradley's face went pale. "You're kidding." She wasn't. And suddenly, everything felt off balance. In the airport's executive terminal across the tarmac, Caleb Mercer stepped off the elevator with fire in his spine. 3 assistants, 2 legal advisors, and 1 executive director struggled to keep up behind him. "Flight OV-214 was cleared 30 minutes ago," the executive director said. "They should have been airborne." "They're not," Caleb said flatly, "because my father was profiled by the crew. He turned, eyes sharp, and no one, not one of you thought to flag the internal escalation report when it listed his name. There was silence. We get over 9,000 passenger logs a day." "Sir," the assistant murmured, "that's not an excuse. That's a broken system." Caleb pushed open the glass doors and headed directly for the operations command center. There, on the central screen, the image of OV-214 sat glowing amber on the tarmac. Still parked, still grounded. "Open direct comms to the captain," Caleb ordered. An operator patched the call through. "Captain Vaughn, this is Mercer. Acknowledge?" The radio crackled. "Copy that, sir. I need your voice on record." "Captain, what happened in the cabin?" A beat of silence. Then a misunderstanding. "Sir?" an assumption made by crew about passenger credentials. Was the passenger belligerent? No, sir. Did he present a valid ticket? Yes, sir. Then why was he asked to leave first class? Another pause, longer this time, because it didn't seem to match his profile. There it was, raw, honest, painful. Caleb closed his eyes. Thank you, Captain. Hold all further activity. I'll be boarding directly. Yes, sir. Caleb hung up and turned to his team. Get me an escort and notify press control. There's going to be coverage inside the plane. The mood had shifted from quiet to confused. Passengers were whispering. The crew had retreated. The doors had not closed. Whispers turned into speculation. Some said it was a bomb threat. Others thought it was a mechanical issue. But Lawrence Mercer knew better. He felt it in the way the silence thickened. Janelle leaned closer. What exactly is your son going to do? She asked gently. Lawrence looked at her. My son, he said, voice even, has been quiet for a long time. He listened. He studied. He endured. Now he paused. He's done being quiet. Outside. The portable boarding stairs were wheeled to the plane. A small black SUV pulled up at the base, and from it, Caleb Mercer stepped out, no blazer, no tie, just a black crewneck sweater, slacks, and eyes like lightning. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a storm. The cabin doors opened, and everything stopped. First class turned, one by one, toward the figure entering. Passengers began murmuring. Some recognized him. Others felt the shift without needing names. Caleb's eyes scanned the cabin once until they landed on the man in two-way. His father. He walked down the aisle without a word. Stopped beside the seat. Dad, he said, voice low. Lawrence looked up. There was pride. There was sadness. There was something too complicated for either. You didn't need to come, he said softly. Yes, Caleb said. I did. A hush spread over the plane. Janelle slowly lowered her phone, which she'd been recording with for nearly a minute now. Ladies and gentlemen, Caleb said, turning toward the cabin. My name is Caleb Mercer. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Orion Vista Airlines, and I need to tell you something. He looked back at his father, and then back to the others. Earlier today, a man was asked to justify his presence in a seat that he had paid for, that he was assigned, and that he was entirely entitled to occupy. Why he let the question hang? Because someone assumed he didn't belong there. Silence. Now. I'm not here to fire anyone publicly, though accountability will happen. I'm not here to grandstand, though I understand the gravity of what this moment has become. He turned back to his father. I'm here because my father taught me to build something better. And if the airline I led forgets who it was built for, then I failed him, and I failed you. Janelle's camera kept rolling. So did 5 others. Caleb placed a hand gently on the top of Lawrence's shoulder. Would you fly this airline again? He asked. Lawrence looked up at his son, his voice barely a whisper, only if it learns to see. Caleb nodded. Then he turned to the passengers. Then that's what we're going to do. For nearly a full minute after Caleb Mercer finished speaking, no one moved. Not a passenger. Not a flight attendant. Not even the captain. There was something unspoken, hanging in the cabin like air after a thunderclap. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It wasn't even about the delay. It was recognition that something real had happened, that someone had been seen. Caleb turned back to his father. Lawrence had remained composed, but the stillness in his eyes had changed. The quiet was deeper now, calmer, as if something had settled inside him. "You didn't need to do this in person," Lawrence said under his breath. "Yes, I did," Caleb replied. "For them." He tilted his chin toward the passengers still watching. "But mostly for you." Trina McCall stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had heard everything, every word from the CEO, every subtle shift in tone, and for the first time in her career, she felt like the uniform she wore no longer fit her skin. She wasn't proud of what she'd done. Not today. Not anymore. It had started so simply. She had seen a man board with a first-class ticket and assumed he was lost. The subconscious reaction, the quiet reflex that years of training had failed to remove, had led her to ask him, without thought, "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" It was subtle, quiet, but that was the nature of it, wasn't it? Discrimination didn't always shout. Sometimes it asked politely. Sometimes it smiled while denying you. And now she could see it so clearly she couldn't unsee it. As the rest of the crew stood frozen, Trina stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly. Caleb turned. "I need to say something. To you, and your father, and to everyone here." She turned toward the passengers. "My name is Trina McCall. I've been with Orion Vista for 17 years, and I'm the one who asked Mr. Mercer to step aside earlier today." Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes did. "I want to say clearly I was wrong. I judged him by his appearance, by his age, by what I thought he should look like to be in first class. And that was not just a mistake. It was a failure." Several passengers turned to look at her, some with surprise, others with something closer to respect. I thought I was trained to see people fairly, but clearly, I wasn't ready to see beyond my own assumptions. And I'm sorry. I am so deeply sorry. She looked at Lawrence. "I hope you'll forgive me. And if you can't, I understand." Lawrence studied her face. His reply came without delay. "Forgiveness isn't mine to grant," he said gently. "It's yours to live." Trina's breath caught in her chest. Caleb looked at her, then back at the rest of the crew, who remained by the galley Bradley, still pale, Jessa, the junior attendant, blinking back a tear. "I respect what you said. Ms. McCall," Caleb said, "and I believe people can grow, but growth has to be followed by change." Trina nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." Caleb motioned to the captain, who had been listening from the cockpit door. "Captain Vaughn, please notify operations. This flight is canceled. The aircraft will return to the hangar for independent audit and crew review." There was a collective gasp from the cabin. "You're grounding the flight," a woman in row 3 said in disbelief. "I'm grounding the airline," Caleb corrected. "For 4 hours. Every aircraft, every terminal, every crew. We will pause, we will examine, and we will re-educate." A man across the aisle raised his hand. "With respect, that's going to cause chaos. Flights delayed. Connections missed." "I understand," Caleb said, his tone respectful but resolute. "But dignity delayed is a greater cost than arrival time. And trust me, when my father was asked to prove his seat, no one worried about his schedule." There was silence again, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful. Janelle Avery, who had recorded nearly everything, lowered her phone and spoke for the first time. "You're not doing this for PR," she said softly. "Are you?" "No," Caleb replied. "I'm doing this because I'm tired of building diversity policies that collect dust. I'm tired of committees that check boxes instead of souls." He looked around the cabin once more. Airlines don't just move people, they move dignity. And if we don't get that right, we don't deserve the sky. Outside the terminal, a media storm was already forming. News outlets had picked up the story through live updates. Janelle's video had already been uploaded with the title "CEO Grounds Entire Airline," after father denied first-class seat and the views were climbing. Inside Operations Command, chaos met control. Dispatchers were instructed to halt all new takeoffs. Flights in the air were advised to prepare for temporary rerouting upon landing. Airport loudspeakers began to echo with the same announcement in every terminal. Attention, all Orion Vista flights are temporarily grounded due to system-wide operational review. Please remain patient. Our staff will provide updates shortly. People were confused. Some were angry, but others, especially those who watched the video, understood something deeper was happening, something overdue. Back on flight OV-214, passengers were beginning to disembark. Caleb remained behind, standing near the exit door with his father. Lawrence didn't speak for a while. He simply watched the others leave. A young woman, perhaps 20, traveling alone, stopped in front of him. Her name tag said Madison. She worked for the airline. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice nervous but warm. "My grandfather was a Tuskegee airman. He never got to sit in first class." Lawrence smiled. "Just a little." "Well," he said gently, "next time, sit in 2A. For both of you." Madison blinked quickly, nodded, and stepped off the plane. When the last passenger was gone, Caleb and Lawrence sat down again, this time side by side. 4 hours, Lawrence said, watching the tarmac. "You always said change takes time," Caleb replied. His father chuckled under his breath. "I also said not all storms come to disrupt. Some come to clear the path." They sat quietly for another few minutes, the plane completely still. Then Caleb asked something he hadn't dared ask in years. "Dad, did I make you proud today?" Lawrence turned toward him, brows raised. "Caleb," he said, softly but clearly, "I've been proud of you since the day you learned to tie your shoes without asking for help. Everything after that was just a bonus." Caleb looked away, just for a moment. His throat tightened, and when he turned back, his voice was low and sure. "Let's make sure no one ever has to earn their seat again." And together they stood, stepped off the plane, and walked into a world that was already beginning to change. The boardroom at Orion Vista's Atlanta headquarters was full, but no one was breathing easy. Vice President of Operations, Melissa Crane, stood with both hands on the polished mahogany table, a line of sweat clinging to her temples. The CEO had grounded every plane in the air. Every terminal was locked down. Media outlets were spinning the headline like wildfire, and customers across the country were filming themselves stranded at gates, demanding answers. Caleb Mercer had done the unthinkable, and for the first time in the airline's 62-year history, the executive team wasn't steering the response. He was, from a tarmac, on a single plane. With a quiet resolve that felt more dangerous than any press conference. "Have we spoken to him?" Melissa asked, her voice tight. "Yes," said Dev Shah, head of internal communications. "Briefly, he said to stand by, that he's conducting a direct field audit." "That's not a thing," snapped Edwin Lowe, VP of Fleet and Logistics. "It is now," Dev replied, rubbing his brow. Silence stretched across the room. In the corner, seated near the window, Angela Beach, Orion's Director of Cultural Strategy, watched the newsfeed playing silently on the mounted screen. The headline read, "CEO Grounds Airline. After Father Denied First-Class Seat Industry on Edge." Her chest ached, but not from surprise, from recognition. She had warned them for years that their diversity training lacked teeth, that their systems favored decorum over truth, that their team, for all its data dashboards and DEI town halls, still carried implicit codes no spreadsheet could fix. But no one listened, not really, until Caleb Mercer stood on a jet bridge and said, "Enough." Angela closed her laptop and stood. "I'm going to the airport," she said simply. Melissa looked up. For what? To meet the fire where it's burning. Back on the tarmac, the flight crew of OV-214 remained grounded physically, emotionally, and professionally. Trina McCall sat in the rear galley, her uniform collar loosened, her ID badge tucked in her pocket. She felt like she was floating in a strange in-between space. Not fired, not forgiven, just seen. And now that the spotlight had moved on, the real heat was setting in. She thought about every passenger she'd ever corrected mid-boarding, every assumption she'd made about who belonged where. It was a blur, like walking backward through a mirror. Bradley Quinn approached quietly. He'd been watching her all day, not with judgment, but with something more complicated, like watching an older sibling get caught doing what you yourself had once done in silence. "You okay?" he asked. Trina didn't answer at first. She reached for a half-empty water bottle, stared at it, then set it back down. "I thought I was," she said finally. "For 17 years. I thought I was fair, professional, good at my job." "You are," Bradley said gently. "No," she corrected. "I was good at control, good at following procedure. But that's not the same as seeing people." Bradley leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Do you think he's really going to fire us?" "I don't know," Trina whispered. "But if he does, maybe I earned it." They sat in silence, just long enough for regret to settle in. Jessa Rinaldi entered moments later, still clutching the clipboard from earlier. She'd barely spoken all day, but now she looked up, her voice shaking. "Ms. McCall, I think you should see this." She handed over the printed statement from headquarters. It had just come in effective immediately. All Orion Vista flight staff involved in the incident aboard Flight OV-214 are placed under direct review. Each crew member will be interviewed individually, with decisions made after thorough assessment. No assumptions, no sweeping judgment, just accountability. At the bottom, one line stood out. Change doesn't begin with blame. It begins with truth. "Si, mem." Trina's throat tightened. Bradley blinked. He signed it. "No," Trina said, touching the initials. He owned it. At Gate 14C. Caleb stood alone for a moment. His father had gone to a private lounge, escorted by a staff member. The passengers had dispersed. The aircraft sat silent behind him, like a witness to a courtroom no one expected to open. Angela Beach approached quietly, dressed in slate gray, clipboard in hand. "You always like to lead from the floor," she said softly. Caleb turned. A hint of a smile broke the hard line of his face. "I got tired of watching from the balcony." Angela nodded. "You've stirred a hornet's nest?" It needed stirring. She waited, then stepped closer. "They're scared up there. You know, the board, the executives." Caleb nodded slowly. "Good. Maybe fear will do what silence hasn't." Angela studied him for a long moment. "Are you going to fire the crew?" "Nummy," Caleb said. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because firing a few people for one failure is easy," he said. "But systems don't change through shortcuts. They change when the people inside them stop pretending to be neutral." He looked back at the plane. Trina McCall made a mistake, a painful one. But she also owned it in front of 100 strangers. That's more than most people ever do. Angela tilted her head. So what? Now Caleb glanced at the runway beyond the glass. We pause. Then we learn. Then we rebuild. He pulled out his phone and tapped a new memo. Operation Sky Mirror. Phase 1 Internal Clean Glass Review. Angela blinked. What is that? Caleb looked up. We put mirrors in every terminal. Not physical ones. Real ones. Crew reviews. Passenger surveys. AI analysis of interaction patterns. If there's a pattern of microaggression, we log it, study it, correct it. Publicly. Angela's eyes widened. You're going public with our failures. Yes, Caleb said. The only thing worse than being blind is pretending we see. She stared at him. This will burn bridges. Then we build better ones, he said. In a dim hotel room 3 miles from the airport, a woman in a green scarf sat watching the news feed. She'd flown Orion Vista a dozen times, had been side-eyed twice, and quietly disrespected more times than she could count. But today, something felt different. She watched Caleb Mercer standing at the gate, tall, calm, unshaken. She didn't know him, but in that moment, she whispered under her breath, like a prayer, "Don't stop." The ripple was just beginning. On the West Coast, a Seattle-based pilot filed a memo titled, "Why I Never Spoke Up Until Now." In Dallas, a black mother shared a video about her teenage son being escorted out of business class 2 months earlier. And in Boston, a major airline's executive team held an emergency meeting to review their own first-class boarding protocols just in case. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about one flight. It was about all of them. And somewhere high above it all, at 39,000 feet, dozens of grounded aircraft floated in limbo, held in space by the weight of a promise finally spoken aloud. The lights in Conference Room Echo 3 flickered once, then stabilized. The walls were pale gray. The air scrubbed sterile with industrial silence. A screen blinked awake at the far end of the room, displaying a single word in clean, sans serif font, Sky Mirror. Trina McCall sat across from the panel of 3. She wasn't in uniform today. Instead, a navy blue cardigan rested on her shoulders, and a silver watch ticked softly on her wrist. Her hair was pinned back neatly, but there was a tiredness in her eyes she hadn't managed to blink away. Across from her sat Angela Beach, the airline's director of cultural strategy, flanked by 2 new faces. One was a civil rights analyst from Veritas Equity Group, and the other, a retired judge known for his neutrality and inflexible standards. Both had been brought in by Caleb Mercer himself. There would be no favoritism, no private deals, just truth. Angela leaned forward gently. McCall, she began, her tone calm but firm. This review isn't an interrogation. It's not disciplinary. Not yet. It's part of what Mr. Mercer is calling a dignity audit. Our goal is to understand behavior patterns, not just yours, but across this flight crew and others. Are you willing to participate fully and honestly? Trina nodded. Yes. Angela tapped the tablet beside her. Let's begin. They pulled up the audio logs and flight transcripts from OV-214. With every clipped exchange, every request denied, every hesitation amplified in 4K clarity. Trina's face stiffened. Then came the question Angela had been holding back. What did you see when you looked at Mr. Lawrence Mercer? Trina's voice faltered. An elderly man, alone, traveling on a busy route. And what did you assume? Silence. Angela didn't press. She waited. Finally. Trina exhaled. That he was confused. Maybe that he'd wandered into the wrong section, I've seen it before. Passengers who think they're in first class when they're not. I assumed he was one of them. And when he said his son had booked it, I didn't believe him, or I didn't want to. Why? Trina stared at the table. Because his face didn't match the power I associate with that section. Angela blinked slowly. His face, his skin, his posture, the clothes, they weren't the markers I'm conditioned to look for. There it was, spoken aloud. The subtle wiring, the 1,000 tiny cues learned from years inside a system that rewarded certainty over curiosity. Trina looked up, her voice cracking. I didn't stop to wonder. I stopped to control. The judge nodded once, writing a brief note. Angela closed the tablet. Thank you, Miss McCall. Your honesty matters more than you know. Outside the room, Bradley Quinn waited on a hard plastic bench, wringing his hands. He wasn't scheduled for his review until noon, but he'd arrived 3 hours early. His foot tapped in a quiet rhythm, like a metronome counting down the moment his name would be called. Across the city, in the Mercer family home. Lawrence sat on the edge of his sunroom armchair, holding a hot cup of peppermint tea. The sunlight stretched across the window panes, warming his face. He hadn't said much since returning from the flight. Even now, with his wife Marla resting in the next room, he felt the weight of the incident in his chest like a quiet boulder. He didn't blame Trina McCall. Not exactly. What she did had hurt, but what it revealed hurt deeper. He had grown up in segregation-era Atlanta, walked his children past voting stations they weren't welcome in, and buried friends too soon after incidents no camera ever caught. And yet, this moment being told, in the twilight of his life, that his presence in a seat his son had rightfully bought was suspect. It cracked something old and buried. His phone vibrated softly. It was a text from Caleb. Sky Mirror is live. Full transparency. You started something. Lawrence smiled faintly, even as a tear crept down his cheek. He hadn't started it, but maybe he was the stone that finally hit the still water. At Orion Vista's media control room, a live stream quietly launched on the airline's internal network. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't polished. It was a video of Caleb Mercer, seated in front of a black backdrop, his sleeves rolled up, no script in front of him. He looked directly into the lens. Today begins a new chapter, he said, not because we got caught, but because we finally listened. He paused. When my father was denied his rightful seat, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a signal that our training doesn't reach deep enough, that our policies protect procedures, not people, that our eyes are trained on behaviors, not routes. He let silence hang in the air. So we've grounded every plane, not out of punishment, but out of responsibility. Our fleet will not fly until every crew member has completed Sky Mirror Phase 1. This includes bias review, role play with accountability specialists, and structured reconciliation sessions. Not lectures, not worksheets, but dialogue. Hard, real, sometimes painful dialogue. He leaned forward. To our passengers watching this, especially those who've ever felt unseen, doubted, or disrespected, we see you now. He ended the recording with one quiet promise. We will not lift off again until we land on truth. The screen faded to black. Inside terminals across the country, stunned silence followed. Some passengers clapped quietly. Others stared at their phones, unsure how to feel. But everyone knew this wasn't performative. It was structural. In Terminal B at JFK, a young flight attendant named Sasha Mendez replayed the video twice. Her shift was scheduled for tomorrow. but she'd just gotten the text from her captain, mandatory delay, grounding enforced. She didn't complain. She just whispered, "Finally," and opened her journal. Her last entry was about a black family she watched being split up because the gate agent assumed the teenage son wasn't part of their group. She'd wanted to speak up, but didn't know how. Now, maybe she could. Back at the Atlanta office, Trina left the interview room with tears drying on her cheeks. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of it. As she walked past the break room, she saw a large mirror being installed on the wall, not a decorative one, a plain, square mirror mounted at eye level. A small sign beneath it read, "Check your reflection before correcting someone else's." Trina stopped and looked at herself, really looked, then she exhaled and walked on. When the airline grounded every flight, the first wave of confusion rippled through social media like a cold front. But by the end of the day, confusion gave way to something more surprising testimony. Stories poured in, not from corporate officials or media personalities, but from passengers, quiet voices who had held memories in silence until now, until someone with enough power finally said, "We're listening." It started with a video posted by a woman named Jada Reynolds. She was a nurse from North Carolina, standing in her kitchen with a tired smile, holding a paper cup from the same airline. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began softly, "but if Mr. Mercer's willing to ground his own airline over what happened to his father, then maybe it's time the rest of us speak up too." She glanced at her phone screen as if steadying herself. "Last March, I was flying home after a 14-hour shift from assisting in a medical conference. I was in scrubs. I was upgraded to first class because a friend had miles to spare. When I boarded, the flight attendant asked if I was sure I was in the right seat. I smiled, handed her my boarding pass. She double-checked. Then again, never smiled back. Jada's eyes moistened. "It's small. Right. Just a double-check. But you start to realize it only happens to you, and folks who look like you, again, and again, and again." The video spread fast, faster than Orion Vista's PR team could prepare for. Within 24 hours, over 3,000 former passengers had posted under the hashtag, #WaWannaBoarded. Some stories were devastating. A woman shared how her autistic son, a black boy of 10, had been pulled aside at the gate while the white children boarded uninterrupted. A caption read, "He still asks what he did wrong. I told him nothing, but I don't know if he believed me." A Korean-American professor recalled being asked if he was the delivery person for the in-flight catering because he was standing near the galley before takeoff. And then came the story of Elijah Benton. Elijah was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, a retired federal archivist. His story was quiet, but brutal in its elegance. He described a flight where he'd been asked to swap seats 3 times before takeoff. Each time, no explanation. Each time, someone else, a white businessman, a middle-aged couple, was moved into the spot he had booked. They called it rebalancing for weight, Elijah had said. But I watched a man 30 pounds heavier than me take my seat. What they were rebalancing wasn't weight. It was comfort. Visual comfort. Caleb Mercer sat at his desk long after midnight, scrolling through the stories, watching faces, hearing voices that had gone unheard for far too long. His office was quiet except for the occasional ping of an alert. Each one reminded him of the breadth of the wound he had uncovered. It was no longer about his father. It hadn't been since the second day. It was about the truth these stories were whispering in unison. We're not isolated. We're patterned. Across the country, cable news programs started airing montages of the testimonies. Airline competitors issued nervous statements affirming their own diversity efforts, but none could match the rawness of what was happening at Orion Vista. The company wasn't hiding from the wound. It was naming it. And now the wound was speaking back. Inside the newly converted Truth Room at Orion Vista headquarters, a sleek space built overnight in a former VIP lounge, Caleb sat across from a group of passengers selected at random from the Thichuan When I Boarded hashtag. No lawyers, no cameras, just voices, real people, unfiltered. Among them was a man named Brian Oduro, a Ghanaian-born educator with a deep, melodic voice. He wore a simple gray blazer, sleeves a little too short for his long arms. He sat upright, calm, and clear-eyed. He began with a story from 5 years ago. I was traveling with my wife, who is white. We were both in business class. I went ahead while she stopped to pick up something at a kiosk. When I got to my seat, the steward asked me for the third time to prove it was mine. Brian's voice didn't shake, but his hands were clenched. Then my wife arrived. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Suddenly everything softened. They brought us extra snacks, extra blankets. It was like the air itself changed. He looked directly at Caleb. What hurts isn't the doubt. It's the switch. Watching someone become human in your presence, only when you're vouched for by someone they already trust. Caleb didn't interrupt. He just nodded. Next was Elena Rodriguez, a young Latina social worker from Arizona. She recounted a flight where she was carrying a large black diaper bag that belonged to her sister. They stopped me at security 3 times. Then on the plane, the attendant pointed at the bag and said, "That doesn't look like a carry-on for someone in first class." She smiled bitterly. I hadn't even sat down yet. Others shared too. A Middle Eastern tech executive, a transgender poet, an elderly Cherokee woman flying home for a funeral. Each had a story. None had ever been asked to share it until now. When the session ended, Caleb stood, visibly shaken but resolute. "You shouldn't have had to hold that alone," he said. "And from now on, you won't." They believed him, not because he had the right words, but because he was sitting in the room to begin with. Back on the ground at JFK, one of the youngest gate agents, Nathan Lee, was sitting in a training session surrounded by others like him, new, hopeful, but unsure. They were watching a training video from the Sky Mirror program. But this wasn't the usual slideshow of do's and don'ts. It was Trina McCall. She was on screen, her eyes tired but honest. She looked straight into the camera. "I got it wrong," she said, "because I thought I was being neutral. I thought I was following protocol. But protocol isn't justice, and neutrality in the face of patterns is participation." Nathan sat a little straighter. This wasn't compliance. This was confession. Meanwhile, Lawrence Mercer sat by the window again, sipping his tea. He wasn't watching the trending videos. He didn't need to. He had lived those stories for 7 decades. But what he was watching was more important. Out in the Mercer family garden, his grandson, little Carter, was drawing on the patio with sidewalk chalk. He was 6, full of questions, and wonderfully unaware of the storm his grandfather had helped spark. Lawrence stepped outside. "What are you drawing?" Son Carter beamed. "A plane. Like the one we took." "Remember." Lawrence nodded, crouching beside him. "Does this one fly?" he asked, smiling. Carter paused. "Only if everyone gets to sit where they belong." Lawrence didn't cry, but his heart did something softer. It opened. Maybe that's what all this was for. Not revenge, not optics, but to build an airline that even a child could understand was fair. The room wasn't large. No grand chandeliers, no polished oak table, just glass walls, a circle of chairs, and the uncomfortable weight of truth that had begun to settle in the bones of the company. They called it the Reckoning Room. It wasn't officially named that, of course, but after a week of sessions with passengers, former employees, whistleblowers, and critics, that's what people were calling it. Inside, Caleb Mercer sat with his sleeves rolled up, a mug of black coffee in one hand, and a legal pad full of names in the other. Around him were 9 department heads, each representing the pillars of the airline human resources: legal, cabin operations, public affairs, internal security, international relations, compliance, onboard services, and crew development. And on this particular morning, one chair sat empty. That chair belonged to Marcus Helm, Vice President of Cabin Operations. Helm had not shown up for 3 consecutive sessions. No call, no message, nothing. Caleb didn't need a report to confirm what his gut already knew. But he waited. He let the others speak. Diana Cho from Internal Security spoke first. We completed a deep review of Helm's correspondence logs. Sir, it appears he intercepted and deleted more than 50 passenger complaints related to racial bias over the last 2 years. Several never reached compliance or HR. There was a long pause in the room. Are we saying, asked Deborah Lorne from Compliance, that this was deliberate suppression of internal reporting? Yes, Diana said, voice steady, and we found something else. She clicked a small remote. The screen lit up with a digital ledger of internal flight memos. Helm initiated a program called SVO Seating Visual Optimization. He claimed it improved the perception of cleanliness and order on board, but in reality, it disproportionately relocated passengers of color from front-facing rows. Someone exhaled sharply. Perception of order, Caleb echoed. Diana nodded. In his own memos, he referred to certain seating arrangements as brand disruptive. Caleb stood up, slowly. His eyes were calm, but there was a thunder just behind them. How long has this been happening? At least 18 months, Diana answered, possibly longer. The room fell into silence again. Caleb looked around at the team, some too stunned to speak, others holding their breath. Then he spoke, voice low and deliberate. Find him, now, and bring me his resignation. Marcus Helm wasn't far. He had taken sick leave and was staying in a condo the company kept near the airport for executives on standby. But when company agents arrived at his door, he didn't answer. They found him 30 minutes later, trying to board a private flight at a nearby airfield. Mr. Helm, said the lead investigator, calmly but firmly. The CEO has requested your presence. Immediately. Helm didn't argue. He just nodded and followed them silently. Back in the reckoning room, Caleb waited. When Marcus entered, there was no greeting. Close the door, Caleb said. It was just the two of them now. Marcus stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes defiant, as if daring Caleb to act. Caleb didn't raise his voice. You ran a program that actively relocated passengers based on race. It wasn't about race, Marcus replied quickly. It was about presentation, front cabin visuals, brand integrity. Caleb tilted his head. You labeled certain passengers as visually disruptive. Do you understand what that means? Marcus. What it implies, Marcus remained silent. Caleb stepped forward. My father was one of them. You shuffled him to the back like cargo. You didn't even know who he was. And even if he hadn't been my father, it would have been just as wrong. Still, Marcus said nothing. Caleb placed a white envelope on the table. This is your resignation. You will sign it. Today, you will also return every bonus you received tied to passenger experience scores under false data, and you will issue a public statement admitting to the program. If you don't, I'll refer this to federal investigation, and I promise you, they will dig. For the first time. Marcus's face flickered with fear. I protected this company, he muttered. No, Caleb said quietly. You protected its illusion. You buried its truth. And in doing so, you nearly destroyed it. He pushed the pen across the table. Marcus signed. Slowly, then left the room without another word. Caleb sat back down, his hands shaking, not from anger, but from the weight of it all. The reckoning wasn't theoretical anymore. It had names, faces, policies, consequences. Later that afternoon, a quiet announcement was made, effective immediately. Orion Vista Airlines has accepted the resignation of Marcus Helm, VP of Cabin Operations. The company has opened an independent audit into all internal seating programs and guest experience metrics dating back 5 years. The statement went viral. Passengers began reposting their stories again, but now, with a sense of relief. The company was finally cleaning house. But inside Caleb, the victory was hollow, because this wasn't about one man. It was never about just Marcus Helm. It was about the culture that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. That evening, Caleb walked the empty halls of headquarters. He found himself in a quiet wing, an old corridor once used for employee milestone photos. There was a large board labeled Founders and Leaders. Dozens of black and white portraits lined the wall. He studied them, all men, all white, all smiling. And beneath each frame, the words, Pioneers of Flight. Caleb pulled out his phone. Mr. Daniels, he said to his assistant, please schedule a design team to come in tomorrow. For what? Sir, I want this wall replaced. With what Caleb looked up, voice quiet but firm, real pioneers, every single employee who spoke up, every passenger who refused to stay silent, starting with my father. Meanwhile, in a town miles away, Lawrence Mercer sat on his porch. The evening breeze stirred his cup of tea. He didn't have to read the headlines. He didn't need to hear the announcements. He knew something had shifted. And he knew his son was building something that didn't just fly. It lifted, not just planes, but people. And this time, no one would be shuffled to the back. Not again. Not ever. The morning after Marcus Helm's resignation, Caleb Mercer arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The sun had not yet risen over the city skyline, and the building still held the stillness of unoccupied space. It was the kind of quiet that carried its own weight, like the hush before a verdict is read or a promise is made. He didn't go straight to his office. Instead, he took the long route, walking the length of the East Wing, past the training centers, the cabin crew lounges, the small memorial wall for employees lost in the early years of the airline. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Caleb entered his office without turning on the lights. The dim blue of early morning spilled through the windows, softening the outlines of the room. His assistant wouldn't arrive for another hour. He had this space, this silence, all to himself. He walked over to the credenza behind his desk where he kept personal files. Most executives filled their shelves with trophies and models of planes. But Caleb kept something else there, a small leather-bound journal, weathered at the corners, a bit of the stitching coming loose. It was his father's. He had found it tucked away in a box of old belongings months ago. after convincing Lawrence to part with a few childhood keepsakes for preservation in a new family archive. At the time, Caleb had only skimmed through it. Pages of personal reflections, sermons, school notes, thoughts about his late wife. But that morning, something drew him to it again. He turned on the small desk lamp, the warm glow spilling across the worn leather cover. He opened it gently, turning past the opening pages until he came to a folded letter tucked neatly between two entries. His name was written on the outside in his father's unmistakable script. He unfolded it slowly, hands suddenly unsure. Dear Caleb, if you're reading this, then something in your heart led you to search for more than answers. Maybe you needed rest. Maybe you needed grounding. Or maybe the world got too loud, and you needed to remember where your roots are. I want to tell you something I never said aloud. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I didn't want it to become a burden. You were never just meant to run an airline. You were meant to lift people. I know you see systems, charts, numbers, data points, but never forget, my son, that every policy affects a person, every delay touches a family, every seat denied has a story behind it. You were 5 years old when you first asked me why some people had to sit in the back of the church. You didn't ask it angrily. You just noticed. That was always your strength. You see what others miss. Don't lose that. If they ever silence your voice, speak through your choices. If they ever try to clip your wings, walk. If they ever tell you that the world can't change, smile softly and prove them wrong. I believe in what you're building, even if I don't fully understand how high you intend to go. But remember this, Caleb's legacy isn't measured in titles or net worth. It's measured in whose lives were changed, because you stood for something when it would have been easier to stay seated. Love always. Dad Caleb sat back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. The weight of it pressed into his chest, not as a burden, but as a calling. He placed the letter down gently and looked out the window. The first light of morning had broken fully now. The city moved below, unaware of what was unfolding in one quiet room above it all. Later that afternoon, Caleb called for an internal broadcast. It was impromptu. No scripts, no media team. He stepped into the small studio used for employee briefings and sat on a stool in front of the camera. No suit jacket, no teleprompter, just him. He began softly. I don't have a statement for you today. I have a story. He told them about the letter, about the journal, about the quiet wisdom his father had written into every corner of their lives without needing to raise his voice. He told them about the day his father was moved from first class, not as a headline, but as a moment, one that still echoed. Then he paused. I know some of you have been afraid to speak, afraid that if you call something out, you'll be seen as difficult or disloyal. I understand that fear, but I want to say something, and I want you to hear it clearly. Silence doesn't protect culture. It poisons it. So we're creating a new initiative. It's called the Open Skies Project. He outlined it in brief, anonymous employee reporting systems, real-time passenger equity data, diversity accountability built into executive compensation, and perhaps most powerfully, the establishment of a passenger advocacy council that would include civilians, not just company insiders. But the most surprising part was what he said next. And I'll start by listening myself. I will be flying incognito on domestic and international routes over the next 90 days. No title, no press, just me, a ticket, and the seat I'm given. Because leadership isn't about issuing change. It's about experiencing the systems we ask others to endure. Then he leaned forward slightly, eyes steady. We're not patching over a wound. We're healing it from the inside. And that begins with truth. The screen faded to black. The internal network exploded within minutes. Cabin crew messaged each other across time zones. Gate agents whispered in terminals. Engineers stopped in break rooms. Some cried. Some cheered. But nearly all of them said the same thing. It finally feels different. That evening, Lawrence Mercer stood at his kitchen sink, the TV softly playing in the background. The news had picked up the internal stream. A commentator was replaying parts of the broadcast. The word unprecedented kept coming up. Lawrence didn't comment. He just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down on the back porch. He didn't need to call Caleb. Didn't need to say anything at all. He knew. His son had heard him. Not just the words on the page, but the life between them. And in that quiet, just as a soft breeze rustled the tree outside, Lawrence whispered something only the stars would hear. I see you, son, and I'm proud. They called her the passenger with the red umbrella. She appeared one evening at Logan International. Steps hurried as rain poured through the gates. A tall woman in her late 40s. She held an umbrella of crimson that stood out among the sea of black and navy. Caleb Mercer boarded Flight OV-214 on his undercover mission just as the woman closed her umbrella and handed it off to a flight attendant. The cabin lights were soft, candles of calm glow in a tense world. The red umbrella had been tucked away in the overhead bin, but its owner remained in seat 7C. As the flight attendant approached to stow her bag, the woman paused, turned, and offered a gentle nod. Something in her eyes suggested she had stories of her own. Caleb watched from 3D, just behind the captain's jump seat. He recorded every gesture, every exchange, not as proof for his next board presentation, but to remind himself that each passenger carried unseen weight. He leaned forward when the attendant asked the woman if she needed assistance. The attendant recognized the umbrella, smiled, and placed it in the bin without comment. Moments later, the woman rose and moved toward the lavatory. As she passed Caleb's row, he caught a glimpse of her name on the seat back. Astrid Callahan. He had not heard it before, but the cadence felt familiar, like an old melody half remembered. He watched her disappear behind the curtain. The plane lifted off smoothly, gliding east above the city lights. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers read magazines, tapped on devices, or closed their eyes. Only Astrid remained alert. She folded her hands calmly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a spot just beyond the seat in front of her. Caleb decided to change seats. He offered his boarding pass to the passenger in 7D with a polite smile and stood. He moved quietly down the aisle until he sat in 7B, directly beside Astrid. She turned toward him, expression gentle. "Good evening," he said quietly. She nodded. "I like your umbrella," he offered. "It's a bold color on a dark night." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. I figure if I can't brighten the sky, I can at least brighten my corner of it." He nodded. There was something in the way she spoke that resonated with him. He introduced himself. She introduced herself. Neither mentioned titles. It felt natural. They spoke about small things. The comfort of window seats. The smooth hum of these particular engines. The smell of recycled air after the doors close. And then she paused. "I once saved a book with a red cover," she said. "I was a librarian at a children's hospital. A little boy asked for a story about flying. I searched and found a book with a bright red jacket about a bird who refused to stay grounded. I kept that book for him long after he left. His mother wrote to thank me. He had passed during treatment. The book went with his sister when she got better. It changed hands 18 times after that. Her voice softened. It taught me that the simplest gestures linger. Just like that umbrella. It belonged to someone else originally. My grandmother. She carried it from Chicago to New York when she fled her past. Then she gave it to me. My way of carrying her forward. Caleb's throat tightened. He understood the weight of memories passed down like heirlooms. He thought of the leather journal, the letter, the policies, the programs. He thought of the countless passengers whose dignity had been dismissed. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. She nodded and folded her hands again. Silence settled between them like an old song. The woman in 7A asked for water. The girl in 7E fell asleep. The man in 6B tuned out the world with headphones. But Caleb and Astrid remained connected by the red apron of memory she carried in her mind. Moments later, the flight attendant returned to collect trash. She paused at Astrid's row, noticed the empty plastic cup in her hand. "Would she like anything else?" she asked. Astrid shook her head. The attendant smiled at her umbrella and said quietly, "I love that red. It brightens the cabin." Astrid smiled. "Thank you." The attendant left, and Caleb turned to Astrid. "Some people call these cabins sterile," he said, "but they can be warm if we choose to notice." Astrid's eyes glistened. "You notice? You noticed my umbrella. That means more than you'll ever know." He shook his head. "I noticed your story. The umbrella just drew my attention." She leaned back against the headrest. "I don't often talk about it. I prefer to live without drama. But when I saw you bored, I felt you were looking for something beyond the usual. So I brought the umbrella back out, a small test." He studied her face. "And what did you learn? People will always need stories to remind them why compassion matters. They forget when life gets narrow. We have to widen our vision, again and again." He let that settle. Then he pointed to his lap where the journal was tucked away. "In my own way," he said, "I'm trying to widen the vision of everyone I can reach." She nodded. "I know. I read your statement on the video, the one where you promised to fly incognito. It wasn't scripted. You've never been just a suit to me. I saw the effort." He was silent for a moment. That meant more to him than any title or photo op. Farther down the aisle, the cabin lights dimmed for rest. The red umbrella, tucked gently in the overhead bin, reflected the glow of the reading lamps. It looked like a lantern in the night. Caleb leaned back. "We'll be rounding New York in about 90 minutes. Would you mind if I stay here until we land? I'd like to hear the end of the story." Astrid looked at him. "You're welcome to it. I don't know how it ends yet. I guess I write that part myself." He nodded. "Maybe that's the only ending worth having." Around them, fellow passengers drifted toward sleep. None realized that two seats held a story unfolding in real time. A story not about policy or protocols, but about the gentle power of being seen. Outside the window, the city lights of New York appeared like lifetimes of stories waiting to be told. And as the plane began its descent, Caleb and Astrid watched together the tapestry of light and shadow below, each bright pixel a moment of recognition in the vastness of the world. They both knew the journey was far from over, but in that shared quiet, they trusted that the next chapter would be kinder, fuller, and more honest than the last. The cabin lights remained dim As Flight OV-214 approached the runway at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, every passenger seemed to sense the weight of what had transpired higher in the sky. The soft hum of the engines was the only background noise as Captain Harris Vaughn's voice crackled over the intercom, thanking everyone for their patience and promising a smooth landing. The man in 2A, Lawrence Mercer, and the man in 3D, Caleb Mercer, exchanged a brief glance and a small nod before fastening their seatbelts. Outside their windows, the docked cargo planes and terminal gates glistened under the late afternoon sun. The runway lights flickered on as the aircraft descended, a ribbon of fire guiding them toward Earth. In the cockpit, Harris Vaughn ran through the standard procedures as if nothing unusual had happened. But for everyone on board, nothing would ever feel routine again. When the wheels touched the runway, a collective breath seemed to escape the cabin. A few passengers applauded, not for the landing, but in homage to the journey they'd just shared. Soft claps swelled into genuine applause until the flight attendants closed the cabin doors for disembarkation. At the jet bridge, a crowd of reporters and cameras waited, their lenses trained on the open doorway. Flashbulbs popped as Caleb and Lawrence emerged first. Lawrence looked calm, leaning on his cane, but his eyes shone with quiet pride. Behind him followed Trina McCall, Bradley Quinn, Jessa Rinaldi, and other crew members who had taken part in the Sky Mirror audit. They walked with measured steps, their uniforms neat, their heads held high. Caleb paused at the base of the jet bridge and raised a hand. He glanced back at the cabin, offering a brief, genuine smile of gratitude. Then he turned to face the press. Microphones jutted toward him like eager vines. He took a steadying breath. Today was not about blame. He began. It was about responsibility. A responsibility that every member of this airline has pledged to uphold. He spoke in calm, even tones, his words carrying the echo of the letter in his journal. He thanked the passengers who had spoken up, the crew who had been brave enough to admit mistakes, and his father, whose dignity had shown him the cost of silent compliance. He announced the formal launch of Project Horizon, the evolved version of Open Skies and Sky Mirror. This initiative would embed passenger equity metrics into every operational decision. It would require all flight staff to engage in quarterly humility sessions, where real stories would be shared and solutions forged. It would also create mandatory community liaison roles in every hub, giving local voices a direct line to corporate leadership. When he finished, the cameras shifted to Lawrence. Journalists edged forward with questions, but Lawrence held up a hand. "I am not here to speak for the company," he said softly. "I am here to remind us all that respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. We all deserve a seat where we see possibility, not prejudice." The press fell silent. Then they applauded once more, louder this time. A few crew members wiped tears away. Bryce Colton, the head of public affairs, stepped forward and thanked Caleb and Lawrence for their leadership. He fielded a few questions about logistics and timelines before ushering the Mercers toward the waiting sedan. As they walked down the ramp, the reporters continued their calls for interviews, but the father and son shared a moment of quiet conversation just beyond the glare of the cameras. Lawrence touched Caleb's arm. "You led well today." "Exactly as I hoped." Caleb's lips curved into a soft smile. "I'm just getting started." Inside the private sedan, the cityscape of Seattle slipped past in a blur of glass towers and evergreen trees. Caleb sat beside his father, their conversation low enough not to reach the driver's ears. "How are you feeling?" Caleb asked. "Physically tired," Lawrence said, "but in a way I never knew I could feel awake." Caleb nodded. that awakening is the point. Progress isn't linear. It's slow, sometimes painful, but it always moves forward. Lawrence studied him. I worry about how much work you've taken on. The company, the passengers, the world. What about the quiet moments? Caleb looked out the window. I'll find them. I have to, because the work never really ends. It evolves. It grows. And so must I. Lawrence rested his head back. You always did. Remember that day I taught you to ride a bike? You fell, got scraped up, but you sprang right back up and said, let's go again. Life's like that. Some falls you remember forever. But what matters is that you get back up. Keep pedaling. That memory flooded Caleb with warmth. He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. I'll keep pedaling. Thank you for teaching me. Back at headquarters, employees gathered in the main atrium to watch the press conference streamed live. Some wore Orion Vista polo shirts. Others carried service manuals or airport ID badges. They stood in clusters, eyes fixed on the large screen as Caleb and Lawrence spoke. When the conference ended, the room remained still for a long beat. Then someone started clapping. Slowly. More joined in until the atrium pulsed with applause. Among the crowd was Trina McCall. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was the initial apology she had drafted after the incident aboard OV-214. She had never had the courage to send it, but with the shift in culture, she finally felt ready. She unfolded the paper, stepped forward, and posted it on the new reflection wall, a permanent installation outside the atrium, filled with apologies, commitments, and stories of growth from employees at every level. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and saw others stop to read her words. Some nodded in understanding, others left small notes in response. A path of empathy began to form. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, Janelle Avery sent her own message to passengers who had tweeted stories under when I boarded. She wrote about her encounter with Lawrence on OV-214, her own commitment to amplify truth in her journalism, and her pledge to continue holding institutions accountable. She tagged Orion Vista's official account and watched as the company replied with gratitude and an invitation to cover the Open Skies Project launch event next week. That evening, a hush fell over Seattle as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Mercer family gathered in a small restaurant near Lake Union for a private dinner. Lawrence, Caleb, Marla, and Caleb's siblings, all of them there, to share a meal that was as ordinary as it was extraordinary. Plates of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, glasses of sparkling water, and the gentle murmur of shared stories. Lawrence raised his glass. To the company, he said, and to all who believe in second chances. To my son, who knows that progress isn't a solo journey. We lift each other. His family echoed the toast, laughter mingling with gratitude. For a moment, the world outside faded, reduced to the glow of candlelight and the comfort of family. Later, Caleb stepped outside onto the restaurant's patio. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine. He looked up at the sky, searching for stars. In his pocket, he carried a small memento, his father's letter, now framed in his office. He knew the work ahead was immense. Rolling out Sky Mirror across international routes, securing funding for community advocacy councils, ensuring accountability reports remained transparent. But in that moment, everything felt possible. He gazed out at the lights dancing on the water of Lake Union. This was the descent, he thought, the landing into something deeper than policy into purpose, and it was only the beginning. He slipped the letter back into his pocket and walked inside. ready to face whatever came next. When the first glimmer of dawn touched the runway of Los Angeles International Airport, Orion Vista Flight OV-214 eased to a stop at Gate 159. The cabin lights brightened slowly, bringing life back to the rows of seats and the faces of passengers who had witnessed a transformation at 39,000 feet. Lawrence Mercer rose from his seat 2A with deliberate grace. His spine was straight, his eyes clear, and his hand gently steadied by the presence of his son, Caleb, seated beside him. Around them lay the quiet hum of a journey not only across miles, but across ideologies and old assumptions. Caleb stood next to his father and offered his arm. The moment felt ceremonial. Journalists and camera crews still lingered at the gate, but they knew this was more than a story of suspension or policy change. It was the birth of a new ethos. When they walked down the jet bridge, the applause was neither scripted nor perfunctory. It was genuine gratitude from crew members, from passengers, from employees who had gathered just beyond the glass doors to welcome the Mercers home. A small boy in a pilot's cap stepped forward and saluted Lawrence. He reminded Lawrence of himself at 6 years old, imagining the sky as a realm of limitless possibility. Lawrence returned the salute with a warm smile and ruffled the boy's hair. Caleb watched, his heart full, as faces all around glowed with an energy of hope and relief. The red umbrella from Astrid Callahan's flight earlier had been donated to a local children's library in Seattle as a symbol of compassion carried forward. News of that act circulated online even before the Mercers reached the terminal building. Inside the terminal, a ceremony was quietly arranged. A velvet ribbon stretched across a new display called the Wall of Witness. Photographs of passengers who had shared their stories under the hashtag When I Boarded hung there alongside first-class tickets and handwritten apology notes from staff members. At the center of the display stood the framed letter Lawrence had written to Caleb decades ago. Beside it lay an open leather journal, the pages capturing reflections on dignity, memory, and the power of compassion. Employees of every rank and department lined the walkway, clapping gently, some wiping tears, as Caleb and Lawrence approached. Caleb took hold of the journal. His voice was steady when he spoke to the assembled crowd. Today we inaugurate not just a display, but a promise that every person who steps onto an Orion Vista flight will be seen in full, that no name will be lost in protocol and no story ignored by policy. We ground our planes to elevate our humanity. We pause our operations to accelerate justice. We begin now with the very foundation of our history. He gestured to the board. These stories remind us that equality cannot be a footnote. It must be written into the margins of every procedure, into the code of every uniform, into the name tag of every crew member. We have replaced an era of silence with an era of openness. Our wall of witness stands as proof that truth, when honored, lifts everyone. Lawrence stepped forward. He placed a hand gently on the open journal. My father once told me that dignity delayed is a wound that deepens with time. Today we close that wound with action, not rhetoric. We ground ourselves in truth so that our flights can soar with integrity. We launched Project Horizon from a jet bridge because integrity cannot wait for boardroom approval. It demands immediate reckoning. The applause that followed was quiet at first, then rose like the swell of a choral hymn. Employees exchanged embraces. Passengers smiled at one another across the terminal like old friends reunited. The airline's executives who had once argued over budgets and schedules now stood united in purpose. Even the regional manager, who had initially resisted the ground order, had tears in his eyes. A soft voice spoke from the side. It was Janelle Avery. She stepped forward with a small camera crew from her independent news channel. Her presence was a reminder that journalism and corporate change could move together, hand in hand. She laid out a draft proposal for a joint passenger press council to monitor equity initiatives in real time. Caleb nodded. He knew transparency completed the circle of accountability. Later that afternoon, Lawrence and Caleb joined Trina McCall, Bradley Quinn, and Jessa Rinaldi in a small meeting room that overlooked the runways. The five of them shared stories over lunch. Trina described her first day back on duty after completing the Sky Mirror audit modules. She spoke of guiding a grieving mother to a quiet corner and offering a listening ear rather than a scripted apology. Bradley spoke of how his confidence had grown when he realized his voice mattered. Jessa shared her plan to volunteer in community outreach programs organized by Orion Vista. They laughed softly, the weight of the past week giving way to a fragile optimism. Caleb listened, his heart buoyed by their vulnerability and their determination. He looked at his father, who sat quietly sipping tea, and felt a surge of gratitude. The story they had written together was more than a PR masterstroke. It was a narrative of redemption written in boarding passes, apology letters, and live audits. It was proof that a single moment of injustice could catalyze a movement that stretched far beyond the confines of a flight plan. By evening, as the sun set over the tarmac, Orion Vista's executives gathered in the boardroom for an extraordinary session. The agenda was not numbers and forecasts, but the final approval of the Open Skies Charter. This document enshrined the principles of equitable treatment, visible accountability, passenger participation, and community engagement into the company's bylaws. It mandated that every executive's performance metrics would include equity impact scores alongside financial targets. It required annual public reports on discrimination complaints and their resolutions. It created a fund for first-generation aviation scholarships named for Lawrence Mercer, funded jointly by the company and its largest investors. When the charter was passed unanimously, the chair of the board, a seasoned industry veteran, leaned back and said quietly, "I have been in this business for 40 years. I've never seen leaders stand up for passengers with such conviction. Thank you for showing us how high respect can fly. Across the globe, in small terminals and grand hubs alike, news of the Open Skies Charter spread. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies. Civil rights organizations offered to partner on training modules. Legislative bodies in several states took note and prepared to propose bills requiring airlines to publish equity metrics. What began as a red umbrella and a grounded fleet had become a blueprint for systemic reform. Back in Seattle, Lawrence and Caleb stood at the gate one last time before parting ways. They embraced quietly, father and son, partners in a mission that transcended commerce and tradition. Caleb pressed a plane ticket-shaped charm into his father's hand. For the next journey, his father would fly with full confidence that dignity would always be his seatmate. Lawrence smiled, tears glistening. We have lifted each other today. That is the highest flight of all. And as Caleb walked away, stepping into the terminal where a new world waited, he carried his father's lesson forward. Legacy is not what is built in boardrooms. It is what is lived in moments of grace. And on Orion Vista flights from every coast to every continent, Grace would now have a permanent first-class ticket. Thank you for journeying with us through a tale that reminds us how fragile yet indispensable human dignity truly is. From Lawrence Mercer's calm refusal to be silenced, to Caleb Mercer's bold decision to ground an entire airline, we've seen that standing up for respect can ripple far beyond a single cabin. Let this story inspire you to challenge unfairness whenever you see it, and to uplift every voice that's been asked to step aside. If Lawrence's quiet strength and Caleb's unwavering love moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate courage, condemn discrimination, and promise hope. Stay tuned. Our next episode is just around the corner, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.